what Jonathan says about the resurrection and reality, of course, raises a particular conundrum, which is that if you're going to use religion as an explanation of reality, you're also describing the event that subverts reality completely. That the resurrection is the thing that is the least possible thing to do given the world as we understand it.
Least possible than the Big Bang, for example. I don't know. I see all scientists move towards something which is least possible, let's say.
As a precondition.
Yeah, of course. That's something that is impossible as a precondition for possibility.
What I'm trying to get to is a sort of, not to diminish it, but having your cake and eating it thing, which is religion explaining reality, reality explained by religion, and also this thing happens that has never been able to happen, and that if you can make that leap, then you've got the faith in religion. I'm not saying that this isn't possible to do. You obviously do it yourself, but it's two things that seem to be in some very, very deep way contradictory. And maybe the contradiction is the point.
Well, I think you also do it imperfectly, you know? I mean, you ask yourself, I mean, you're in some ways on the edges of the cultural battlefront. You know, you ask yourself, well, how much of the catastrophe of the world can you voluntarily take on? There's many, many problems that beset us, and there's a great adventure in trying to rectify them. And it's an open question how much better you can get at that if you proceed in the spirit of goodwill. I think that's an indication in the most fundamental sense of your belief. You know, because we don't want to reduce this to a proposition again, because I don't think that's the right, I think it's an axiom of faith. It's something like, okay, do I believe in the resurrection? It's like, well, it's not a scientific proposition. At least I'm not going to treat it that way at the moment. It's a manner of confronting reality. And so then it would be a statement of faith, which is that I believe that if I act oriented towards love and life more abundant, and if I speak the truth, then I can prevail against the gates of hell. And I'm willing to put my life on the line to see if that's true. And I would say that's the faith, right? Because who knows? But what's the alternative? It's like, are we going to accept the ultimate, what would you say, the ultimate metaphysical reality of the pointlessness of being and the atrociousness of hellish suffering? I mean, it looks to me like we can rectify that. And it also looks like we have to move towards that rectification in something like faith, right?
Okay, but let me return to the two questions I posed earlier on about this, where the thing that the religious have a problem with and the thing that the non-religious have a problem with. Putting my cards on the table, I would be relatively happy for Jonathan's view to be dominant in my society, and for me never to be asked whether I literally believe in the resurrection. To dodge the question. I'd be relatively happy for that to be the situation, because there is the place where we get into an awful lot of problems. But that there is virtue and good in what he's describing. We could leave it as a mystery unless our age happened to be leaning on this because it needed to know whether the story was literally true, more than Dostoevsky, more than the great poetry, that it was the thing that we relied on more than anything. You would need to know that in that situation.
So I think that for sure Christians believe that the resurrection happened, that it's an event, that it's something that is not just a fiction in the simplest sense. But they also do insist that you can't describe it in terms of mechanical causes, that it cannot be reduced to that. And so when people always ask me, like, did Jesus sit up in the grave? And I'm like, that's not what the text says. If you read what it says in Scripture, it leaves it very mysterious at what the event is. I think for the reason that it is in some way a meta event. It's an event which is, even in Scripture, there's even this description that talks about Christ as being the lamb that was sacrificed before the foundation of the world. That is the notion that the sacrifice, that the death and the resurrection of Christ is in some ways the foundation of reality. So, and it's not, I know it's hard because people are such scientists and such materialists that they struggle, but that's why I try to help people understand this, the fact that attention precedes phenomena. And that's why sacrifice comes before phenomena. The importance of sacrificing the externals, of being able to perceive and give up the unity of something. That is actually the foundation of reality. And so it's ritualized in cultures as actual physical sacrifice, that's fine. But then it leads up to the mystery of Christ, which is that ultimately the highest version of that is self-sacrifice. And if you do that and you participate in that, you are gaining a key to the mystery of how reality actually lays itself out.
Let's look at, I've always been struck by Michelangelo's Pieta. And so, because it's a sacrificial offering. And so we could say, well, what's the precondition for the life of an autonomous child? And the precondition is that the mother is willing to offer up the child as a sacrificial entity in the face of life. And the psychoanalysts used to describe the necessary failure of the mother. So that's the anti-Oedipal mother. The Oedipal mother protects and shelters, right, and then destroys because of that. Whereas the non-Oedipal mother lets go so the child can be hurt and broken and killed by the world. And so then you might say, well, the willingness to sacrifice the innocent to the realities of existence is a precondition for existence. And I actually think that's true. And so Jonathan's notion that the sacrifice of the innocent lamb is a precondition for existence, you could say at least that that's true phenomenologically. Or maybe for the existence that isn't hell, because that's another way of thinking about it.
Let me just pick up on this point again, because we might be returning to this what I describe as these two problems we've got to address. The first is whether it's possible to accept the idea of religion being true in some sense and essentially philosophy for the masses, which is how many 19th century thinkers were already thinking about it. That you can say it's true in some sense, and it's the best way to allow the largest number of people to contend with the deepest set of ideas, because philosophy is only ever going to be an elite sport, and in no derogatory term of the meaning elite, but only a small number of people are going to engage in it. Most people are not going to engage in it. Therefore, religion is the best means to engage with meaning in the world. That's one way of seeing things to begin with. But the second, and that's something we could contend with. But the second thing I wanted to say is just to give Jonathan a breather, as it were, on some of my demands, which is what about the non-religious in this? And the non-religious problem in all of this, it comes back to what you described earlier, Jordan, as the patterns problem. The patterns we see in the universe, including patterns of truth. What does the non-believer do when they find, for instance, the beauty of a mathematical formula which works and is there and is true? What does it mean? What does it mean when we find the extraordinary patterns in nature? What does it mean when we find patterns in our own lives? And what you describe as things like that thing that people can recognize, of needing to see through the void and see the glimpse of light. What do we do about the sense, for instance, that we know that we're contending with a very, very difficult problem in our lives, so many difficult problems in our lives, one of which, perhaps the deepest of which is, does this matter? Does this matter beyond itself? Or one of my favorite quotes from Rilke. Rilke says in one of the Duino elegies, does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Does the outer space into which we dissolve taste of us at all? Now, our senses, probably one of our deepest hopes is that the answer is yes. Yes. That what we do in our lives does not just matter to us or just to the people around us, although that's not nothing, but matters in some far higher sense. And then we get to that question underneath that, which is, are we simply meaning-seeking beings, or is there meaning? And the problem with this question is it leans us towards the second one. Our deepest hope is that the second one is true.
Okay, so when I look at that, I start by trying to determine what people react to as if it's real. And the scientific answer would be, well, there's nothing more real than matter. And I would say, no, that's not actually how people act. When push comes to shove, people act like there's nothing more real than pain.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't argue yourself out of pain, or you can do that with great difficulty. And so we can start with the reality of suffering. And then I would say that that's a phenomenological description or an existential description of reality. But I'm okay with that because I'm not going to make the assumption that reality is fundamentally material and devoid of purpose. It might be, but it might not be, because we're trying to figure out what's fundamental. Okay, we act as if pain is real. We act as if the pain of infants is particularly real. Okay, then you might say, well, is there anything more real than pain? And I would say, yeah, there is. The meaning that overcomes pain is more real than the pain. And then I would say, well, that's actually what meaning is. And I can speak psychologically about this. It's like, we know the quality of a meaningful experience. It's engaging, it's engrossing, it activates positive emotion and enthusiasm, it makes people more creative, it quells anxiety, and it's an analgesic, probably mediated by opiate mechanisms. And then the phenomena of meaning seems to emerge on the axis between chaos and order. And so let's say that we fall into a deeply meaningful conversation like the one we're having now. And the reason it's meaningful is because our nervous systems are signaling to us that we're inhabiting a structure that we comprehend and that's secure, and that we understand what's going on. So we're not anxious and upset, but we're moving new information into that structure at an optimized rate. And our nervous system signals to us that that's deeply meaningful, and that regulates our positive emotion and quells our negative emotion. But I think all of that's occurring in relationship to this entire hierarchy of attentional priority that we described. And so the more deeply meaningful something is, the more it's associated with every level in that hierarchy, all the way up to the level of divinity itself. And then it's a matter of faith. It's like, well, is that a reflection of fundamental reality? And the answer might be, it might be.
We also don't have access to any other reality. Like, it's actually the other reality that doesn't participate in this hierarchy of attention, this hierarchy of goods, which is it's like I would say a delusion, but it's at least something that you're positing without much proof that it exists. The idea that the world out there completely exists neutrally without a value hierarchy which sustains it into unities is something which I think is more dubious than the other way around. Mm-hmm. And so that you could
I think the scientific evidence supports that proposition now.
You could take your idea of pain and meaning, and you could reduce it to the most simple experience of the world, which is question, answer. What is pain? And that is the meaning. And that happens all the time. Like you encounter a phenomena that you've never seen before. And that phenomena is screaming at you, like, am I dangerous? What am I? What is this? And then there's the manner in which we're able to bring it together and to give it a name and to identify it. And that's already meaning. Identification of things, especially if we understand that it necessitates a hierarchy of attention, is always meaning. It's actually harder to live without meaning. You can't move without meaning.
Right.
Like you
right.
can't
point your eyes without.
You would just lay in bed and wait to die without meaning. Like nothing would exist nothing would have light in it.
I completely agree. I mean, I think it's one of perhaps the biggest questions of our age of where you can find that, as it always has been. It's just that the options in the buffet at the moment are all demanding of something which a lot of people in our society, at the very least, find it hard to accept. What you've just described about, the nature of sacrifice, for instance, and all these things, we know from Girard and others. I mean, these are at such a deep level that they certainly come before religion. They certainly come before any of the religions that we currently have in the world today still operating. I mean, what's the oldest religion we have in the world? Judaism, that's still actively a religion that's 3,500 years old or whatever is young compared to the instincts we're talking about, such as the need for a scapegoat, the need for sacrifice. I mean, we go back thousands of years and we keep finding some kind of organized belief system which believed in sacrifice, and totally futile sacrifice in the cases of most of these ideas. But the question of meaning that comes from that is, I come back to this thing that Jordan was just touching on. I agree, Jordan, that this, if we agree that the thing that's most real and most to be overcome by us in our lives is suffering, then we have to work out what the thing is that can counter suffering. And then we find that there's probably only one thing in the world that can counter suffering, which is love. And that's an instinct. That's an instinct that we may have because of the tradition that we've come from. It's possible. Or it's possible that it is at such a deep level that people had it whether they came from this tradition of ideas and reality or not.